Picture the air in Flint, Michigan in November of 1983. It has that, that deep metallic chill, the kind of biting cold that just sinks right into your bones and tells you winter hasn't just arrived. It's basically settling in for the long haul.
Yeah, that real Midwestern freeze.
Exactly. So in this quiet working class neighborhood, a 16-year-old girl named Sherry Joe Elliot is getting ready for school. Just an ordinary Tuesday. Her mother, Joyce, calls out the typical mom warnings, right? Like, dress warm, bundle up.
Right. Just the mundane details of a Tuesday morning.
Yeah. It's a 2-block walk to the bus stop. It's a route Sherry takes every single day of her life. She steps out into the cold, heads down the street, and she vanishes. Just completely, utterly disappears.
It is the kind of sudden, inexplicable void that completely shatters a family's reality. I mean, one moment, a child is part of the rhythm of the house, the smell of breakfast, the rush to catch a bus.
Right.
And the next moment, there is just an agonizing, echoing silence. The transition from normalcy to a total nightmare is practically instantaneous.
And what we are doing in this deep dive today is stepping directly into that silence. We have a massive stack of case files, police reports, family interviews, and some incredibly cutting-edge forensic lab results on the table.
A lot of ground to cover.
So much. The mission for you today, as you're listening, is to track the 43-year evolution of a case that sat absolutely frozen in time. We're going to walk from the initial, incredibly flawed assumptions of 1980s law enforcement through decades of agonizing false starts right up to the forensic genome sequencing of 2026.
And the central paradox of this entire deep dive, the thing you really need to keep in mind, is how the most monstrous, unspeakable acts can be committed by people who are hiding completely in plain sight.
Yeah, that's the scariest part.
It really is. We are analyzing a predator disguised as a respected citizen, a family man, a guy who, mows his lawn, pays his taxes, waves to the neighbors. And we'll see exactly the mechanics of how modern technology is finally stripping away those masks, literally molecule by molecule.
But look, before we get into the science, before we even touch the genome sequencing or the digital mapping of case files, we have to talk about Sherry.
Absolutely essential.
Because if we just jump straight into the forensics, we lose the human gravity of what was stolen here. We also really have to understand who the police were looking for, because their fundamental failure to understand her baseline personality, well, it doomed the first 48 hours of this investigation.
Right. Victimology is the absolute bedrock of a missing persons investigation. Understanding the habits, the psychological baseline, the daily rhythms of the missing person that dictates the entire trajectory of the search.
It sets the compass.
Exactly. If you get the victimology wrong, you're essentially searching for a ghost, while the real person slips further and further away.
So let's look at the family's notes on Sherry, because her baseline was the furthest thing from a rebellious wild child. When she was a toddler, she didn't run around the house getting into trouble. She would sit in a corner for hours with a thick coloring book.
Just intensely focused.
Yeah, meticulously staying within the lines. And there's a story from when she was 7 years old, visiting Florida. She took a really nasty fall off a 3-wheel bike and scraped her face up incredibly badly.
That detail actually tells us a lot about her resilience, but also her adherence to structure.
Right, because despite the scraped nose, she still proudly walked down the aisle as a flower girl in a purple dress for her uncle's wedding. She fulfilled her role. She was sweet, respectful, deeply loved by her extended family, and she lived a highly structured life.
Very rigid routines.
Yeah, her daily routine as a teenager was practically set in stone. Every day after school she came home, she made herself a specific snack. It was homemade yogurt mixed with Cool Whip, which she'd pop in the freezer.
Such a specific, quirky teenager thing.
Totally. And then she would sit down to do her nails and watch The Young and the Restless.
Deviations from rigid routines like that, they are immediate red flags in behavioral analysis. Someone who meticulously schedules their afternoon snack and their soap opera does not spontaneously decide to abandon their life on a freezing Tuesday morning.
No, of course not. She was also incredibly meticulous about her appearance. She wouldn't leave the house unless her hair was perfect and her clothes perfectly matched. But the most important detail in these files, the one that really screams off the page, is her extreme risk aversion.
This is a crucial point.
Her mother recounted a time when Sherry was living with her dad for a bit. A car pulled up to ask her and a friend for directions. Her friend walked right up to the window to help. Sherry flat out refused. She backed away.
She wouldn't even go near the car.
She would not approach a strange car under any circumstances.
That establishes a really clear psychological barrier. It means that an opportunistic abduction, someone just asking for directions and grabbing her, would have required overwhelming physical force or a highly sophisticated ruse.
Because her natural instinct was just evasion and distrust of strangers?
Right. She wasn't going to be easily lured.
And on the morning she vanished, she had even asked her mom to leave for the bus early. Her mom said no, it wasn't safe, adding that she didn't want the police knocking on her door saying something terrible happened.
God, that is just, it's haunting.
It breaks my heart just reading it.
Yeah.
So, when Sherry doesn't come home for her yogurt and soap opera, her parents immediately panic. They call the police. And the Flint Police Department's initial reaction, they take a look and say, well, she's a teenager, she's a runaway.
To understand that reaction, you have to really look at the institutional mechanics of policing in the early 1980s.
Right, because it sounds crazy to us now.
It does. But the runaway classification was essentially a triage mechanism back then. Police departments were dealing with high volumes of actual teenage runaways, kind of a cultural hangover from the transient youth movements of the 70s.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and because of that volume, there's this pervasive institutionalized culture of waiting. They often imposed mandatory waiting periods of 24 or 48 hours before they would dedicate resources to officially classify a teen as an endangered missing person.
But the family knew instantly this was wrong. She left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. I mean, a girl who meticulously matched her outfits does not run away to start a new life with zero belongings.
It defies all logic based on her victimology.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Labeling a missing teen a runaway in those crucial first 48 hours feels like a massive systemic failure. If I can try an analogy here, it's like a fire alarm going off in a building, and the security guard decides it's probably just a drill, so they literally mute the alarm panel instead of checking the hallways. You are intentionally tuning out a crisis.
This is a very apt analogy.
So how much does cognitive bias play into police wanting a missing person case to just have an easy explanation?
It's huge. It is deeply rooted in confirmation bias, but it's also compounded by resource constraints. An abduction categorization requires an immediate, massive mobilization. You're talking about setting up roadblocks, issuing media alerts, bringing in off-duty officers to canvass neighborhoods.
Which costs a lot of money and time.
It drains budgets and manpower instantly.
Huh.
A runaway categorization, however, that just requires filling out a piece of paper and putting it in a file cabinet. Human nature, particularly within strained bureaucratic systems, often leans heavily toward the explanation that requires the least immediate expenditure of energy.
So they looked at her age and let a statistical probability override the specific facts of her life.
Precisely.
And by doing that, they lost the absolute most critical window of an investigation, the golden hours. While the family was out there frantically searching dumpsters, passing out flyers, with her mother losing 10 pounds in a single week from sheer terror.
The physical toll on the family is just devastating.
And the police were basically in a holding pattern. I mean, they put her name into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center computer. But if you think about how that works, that only helps if another cop happens to pull her over or run her name somewhere else.
It's an entirely passive system.
Right. It's passive. They didn't actively hunt for a predator because they convinced themselves there wasn't one to hunt.
And the tragedy of that assumption is that the reality of the situation was unfolding in the worst possible way, completely undetected by law enforcement.
We have to move forward to November 20th, 1983. This is about 15 miles north of Flint in Saginaw County on this desolate stretch called Mueller Road. A local trapper is out checking his lines, and he finds Sherry's body in a watery drainage ditch just off the roadway.
The transition from missing to murdered is always a brutal shock.
And the details of this crime scene are horrific. I want to prepare you if you're listening, because this is grim, but it is necessary to understand the nature of the person who did this. She was found face down. Her head had been submerged in the freezing water long enough to be disfigured.
The elements really ravaged the scene.
Yeah, her pants were unbuckled, which immediately indicated a sexual assault. And she had been shot 4 times. Once in the abdomen, 2 in the back, and 1 in the back of the head.
If we break down the spatial distribution of those gunshot wounds, it tells a very specific, chilling story.
What does it tell us?
Well, the shot to the back of the head is the hallmark of an execution-style killing. This wasn't a struggle that escalated accidentally, and it wasn't a panicked firing of a weapon from a distance as someone ran away.
Right, it was intentional.
It was a deliberate, calculated, close-range termination of a life to silence a witness.
But there's a strange contradiction here, Ray, because there was absolutely no attempt to bury her. No attempt to conceal the body deep in dense woods or weigh it down in a lake. She was just shoved down into a ditch by the side of a road.
That juxtaposition is key to profiling the offender. You have extreme, almost ritualistic violence in the execution, paired with absolute carelessness in the disposal.
So they didn't care about hiding her.
It suggests a killer who is highly organized and lethal during the commission of the crime, maintaining total control over the victim, but who becomes completely dismissive of the victim the second the act is over. They treated her like literal refuse.
The medical examiner's findings add a layer of psychological torture for the family that I honestly struggle to comprehend. The autopsy revealed that she did not die instantly. She survived the initial assault and the gunshot wounds.
Which is just horrific to think about.
She lay in that freezing water in the ditch, ultimately bleeding to death over a period of time. And based on the timeline and her physical condition, they realized her captor had held her for 3 to 4 days prior to killing her. 4 days of absolute terror.
When a family learns about those lost days, it permanently alters their grief. The ambiguity of what happened during those 3 to 4 days becomes an agonizing obsession. Now, looking at the crime scene processing from 1983, we have to acknowledge the scientific limitations of the era.
Because physical evidence was incredibly sparse, right?
Very. The killer didn't leave a weapon. They didn't even recover the bullets from the mud. But the investigators did adhere strictly to protocol. They collected her clothing, they took fingernail clippings, swabs, and they completed a full sexual assault kit.
Which included a sanitary napkin that contained semen.
Correct.
I am always fascinated by this aspect of historical cases. In 1983, DNA profiling just didn't exist in the criminal justice system. Collecting those swabs and that sanitary napkin feels like taking a highly complex biological puzzle, sealing it in a box, and tossing a biological message in a bottle into the ocean of the evidence locker.
That's a great way to put it.
They had no idea if the technology to read it would ever even exist. So if you're a detective or a crime scene tech in 1983 collecting evidence you can't process, are you just going through the motions, or is there a genuine belief that science will eventually catch up?
They certainly weren't conceptualizing the mapping of the human genome or identifying single nucleotide polymorphisms, that's for sure.
Right, that sounds like sci-fi back then.
In 1983, the pinnacle of biological evidence processing was serology. They were looking for blood types, A, B, or O, and checking for specific enzymes. They were hoping the attacker was what's known as a secretor, someone whose blood type can be determined from other bodily fluids like semen or saliva.
So they were hoping for a blood type match, basically.
Exactly. But the rigorous discipline of evidence preservation isn't about knowing exactly what the future holds. It's about safeguarding the potential of the unknown. You secure the artifact not just for what the microscope can show you today, but for what entirely new fields of physics and biology might reveal 50 years from now.
The heartbreaking part is that while the evidence was perfectly secured for the future, the immediate investigation was totally trapped in the 1980s. They had to rely on the deeply flawed tools of human memory, circumstantial assumption, and just massive public panic.
And that's a dangerous combination.
Let's look at the setting. Flint, Michigan, in the early 1980s was a General Motors boomtown. Automobile manufacturing was roaring. People had good union jobs. They were making real money. A city that size obviously has its share of crime. But the brutal, prolonged abduction and execution of a sweet, shy 16-year-old girl profoundly shocked the community.
And when a community is shocked, it generates a massive influx of public information. The police open up tip lines, and the community delivers. The problem is, an avalanche of raw data is both a blessing and a curse.
Because they were suddenly buried under thousands upon thousands of leads.
Right.
Mountains of them. And this is exactly where we see how a desperate public search for answers can severely sabotage an investigation. They are trying to chase down every lead, but one tip stands out because of the massive resources it wasted. A man came forward, sat down with the police, and confidently stated that he saw Sherry get into a yellow Camaro.
A yellow Camaro, yeah.
They showed him her picture. They asked, "Are you absolutely sure this is the girl you saw?" He looked at it and said, "Yeah, that's her."
This represents one of the most dangerous phenomena in criminal investigations, the confident, fabricated eyewitness. Based on that single assertion, the intelligence section mobilized entirely. They generated physical lists of thousands of yellow Camaros registered in the region.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I want you to really think about the logistics of that. This is before you could just run a localized SQL database query on a laptop. They are manually pulling records, physically driving out to addresses, and running down thousands of cars.
Just burning through man hours.
Days, weeks, and months of investigative manpower were poured into hunting down this yellow Camaro, and the result, it was a complete fabrication. The man was lying through his teeth.
It's astounding.
What truly baffles me is that the mother noted this man had a daughter himself. Why would a father voluntarily inject himself into a child murder investigation with a blatant lie, knowing he is pulling detectives away from finding the actual killer? How do investigators even untangle malicious false tips from genuine misremembering?
It is incredibly difficult. And it speaks to a very dark, complex facet of abnormal psychology. Sometimes it is a pathological narcissistic need for attention, a desire to feel important, or to insert oneself into the center of a highly publicized tragedy.
Like they want to be part of the movie.
Exactly. In other cases, it starts as a misguided attempt to be helpful. A vague, unrelated memory of seeing a yellow car morphs into a confident delusion under the intense pressure of police questioning and a desire to please authority.
Regardless of the motive, the operational result is catastrophic.
It creates a massive wall of noise that completely drowns out the quiet, subtle signals of the actual evidence.
While the police are wasting months chasing phantom Camaros, they are also falling victim to severe investigative tunnel vision somewhere else. They needed a suspect, and they locked their sights onto Robert Schulz, Sherry's stepfather.
If we look at this objectively from a purely statistical standpoint, the police focusing on the stepfather is standard operating procedure.
Right, the statistics are grim.
Criminology dictates that in the vast majority of juvenile homicides, the perpetrator is someone intimately known to the victim. The family circle is always the first ring of investigation, and you work your way outward. Furthermore, Robert was the very last person to see her alive in the house that morning.
I understand the statistics, I really do. But the way they executed this investigation, it's a nightmare. Imagine you have just lost your stepdaughter in the most brutal, torturous way imaginable. Your family is destroyed, and suddenly you are the primary villain in the eyes of the law.
It's an unimaginable burden.
You have detectives scrutinizing your grief. They found minor, totally understandable inconsistencies in his timeline from the morning she vanished, and they weaponized them. They noted he was angry during interviews and that he point-blank refused to take a polygraph.
Which is often misinterpreted.
Of course he was angry. They were implying he raped and executed his own child. Relying on eyewitness testimony like the yellow Camaro and then fixating on a grieving parent is like trying to navigate a maze using a map drawn by a pathological liar.
The refusal to take a polygraph is a classic double bind for any suspect, innocent or guilty. If an innocent person takes a polygraph while in the throes of acute traumatic grief, their physiological baseline is completely chaotic.
So they're doomed to fail it anyway.
They are highly likely to fail the machine's parameters simply due to nervous trauma, which the police will then use as leverage. If you refuse the polygraph out of principle or on the advice of legal counsel, investigators immediately interpret that refusal as consciousness of guilt.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
In this case, the investigators were operating under intense public pressure to close a high-profile case. They looked at his entirely normal defensive posture and mapped their own suspicions onto it.
They pushed the suspicions so far that they actually convinced Joyce, the grieving mother, to record a surreptitious one-party consent phone call with her own husband to try and catch him slipping up or confessing.
That is tearing a family apart from the inside.
Can you imagine the psychological damage of being asked to betray your grieving spouse because the police are convinced he's a monster? They got nothing from the recording, of course, because he didn't do it, but it raises a huge question about investigative integrity when traditional methods hit a wall.
When interrogations, tip lines, and neighborhood canvassing failed to produce a confession or a physical link, the investigation simply hits a brick wall. The human elements of the case run dry.
And the case goes cold.
At that point, the detectives, whether they realize it or not, are just waiting for an investigative tool that hasn't been invented yet.
And so the waiting game begins. When we use the term cold case, it sounds so clinical, but the reality is anything but. Decades pass. The seasons change, the detectives retire, but for the family, time stops.
Grief doesn't have a statute of limitations.
Joyce was tormented by recurring nightmares. She would dream of her daughter standing there asking, "Mom, why haven't you found me?" Robert, the stepfather, lived under this heavy, suffocating cloud of suspicion that profoundly impacted his health and his standing in the community. The pain doesn't fade over 40 years, it just petrifies.
It is important to note, though, that law enforcement didn't completely abandon the files to the basement. The evolution of forensic science eventually forced the case open again. In 2002, the Michigan State Police Violent Crime Task Force in the Flint area decided to take a fresh look.
And this is where we see the first real modern attempt to utilize that biological evidence meticulously preserved back in 1983.
Right, because by 2002, DNA technology wasn't just theoretical anymore, it was actively solving crimes.
Over the preceding 2 decades, detectives had collected around 123 physical DNA samples from various persons of interest, hoping for a direct match. The forensic lab took that sanitary napkin from 1983, and they managed to extract an STR profile, a short tandem repeat profile of an unknown male from the semen.
Which was a huge breakthrough at the time.
They took this profile, which felt like the Holy Grail, and entered it into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the massive national database. They waited for the hit, and absolutely nothing.
What's fascinating here is that this failure highlights the specific structural limitations of early 2000s DNA technology.
How so?
Well, STR testing is phenomenal if you already have a suspect sitting in an interrogation room, or if your suspect is a career criminal already in the database. STR looks at specific short sequences of DNA that repeat themselves, and it measures the number of repeats at various loci or locations on the genome.
Okay, so it creates like a highly specific barcode for an individual.
Exactly. But if that barcode isn't in the scanner system, it tells you absolutely nothing about who the person is. CODIS is fundamentally a closed-loop system.
Wait, if CODIS has millions of profiles in it, why do we call it a closed loop? Why didn't it catch them?
Because CODIS is strictly a repository of DNA profiles collected from individuals who have intersected with the justice system in specific ways, usually those convicted of, or in some jurisdictions arrested for, felony crimes. It is not a database of the general public.
Right, so if you never got caught for a felony, you aren't in there.
Furthermore, CODIS did not go into full mandatory national deployment until the mid to late 1990s. If an individual committed a horrific crime in 1983, managed to avoid arrest, and never reoffended or was never caught for a subsequent qualifying offense after the 90s, their DNA simply wouldn't be in the system.
Wow.
The killer's profile was sitting right there in CODIS, perfectly preserved and perfectly sequenced for 2002 standards, but it was shouting into an empty room.
So the investigation stalls out again. It feels like these detectives are running an exhausting marathon where the finish line keeps magically moving backward. Every time they take a new DNA swab from a person of interest over the years, it's a spin of the roulette wheel.
And the false hope is agonizing for the family.
Fast forward 20 years to 2022. They get a call from a Border Patrol agent out in Utah. The agent flags a guy who used to be Sherry's neighbor back in Flint in 1983. This guy fled Michigan right after the murder and had been living out west under a fake name for 16 years.
Talk about a massive flashing red flag.
Seriously, the detectives get a search warrant, they fly out, they get his DNA, they run it against the 1983 sample, and it's not a match.
Which is a stark reminder of how bizarre and disconnected human behavior can be. People run, hide, and assume new identities for a myriad of reasons. Tax evasion, avoiding child support, escaping abusive relationships, or running from entirely unrelated crimes.
So it was just a crazy coincidence.
The timing was highly suspicious, but biologically he was innocent of this specific act. For the investigators, it's a frustrating dead end. But for the family, it is a devastating emotional roller coaster that climbs to the peak of hope and plummets into despair.
And that takes a severe toll. Joyce, who had endured this cycle for nearly 40 years, eventually reached her breaking point. She told the police, "I can't do this anymore. Unless you have something absolutely new and definitive, I can't do it. Every time you call, you put me right back to where I was when she first died."
That is so hard to hear.
If you're listening, imagine the cruelty of having the worst day of your life reset every few years. It makes me wonder, at what point does reopening an investigation and updating the family do more psychological harm than good if you don't have definitive proof?
You are identifying the profound ethical dilemma at the heart of cold case work. Detectives are driven by the imperative to solve the crime and hold the perpetrator accountable. But every time they knock on that door to provide an update that isn't a final resolution, they are forcibly reopening a traumatic wound that the family has spent decades trying to scar over.
They're just ripping off the Band-Aid.
The brain is forced to reprocess the acute grief all over again. This dynamic is exactly why traditional investigative work and traditional STR-DNA testing had reached their absolute limits in this case. A total paradigm shift in how we process evidence was required.
Which finally brings us to the year 2025. This is where the narrative sharply pivots from a tragedy of systemic errors and technological limitations into an absolute masterclass in modern forensics. Detective Sergeant William Art takes over the case for the Michigan State Police.
And immediately he is faced with a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, he inherits tens of thousands of pages of files. These are handwritten notes, typed reports, blurry photographs generated by 20 different prior detectives over 40 years, all sitting in physical, decaying cardboard boxes.
You cannot solve a complex, multi-decade cold case if you cannot rapidly synthesize the historical data. Human memory cannot hold 40 years of fragmented, contradictory investigative notes.
It's just too much paper.
Right. If you get a new lead, but you can't remember if a detective interviewed that person in 1987, the lead is useless.
So, Detective Art does something genuinely brilliant. He partners with Western Michigan University. He brings in background-cleared university students to act as a specialized digital assembly line.
This is such a smart move.
These students take these chaotic physical files. They learn to decipher the old police jargon, determine what is useful data versus administrative filler, and they meticulously digitize the entire investigation. They organize 40 years of chaos onto a highly searchable, modern digital platform.
It is nearly impossible to overstate how critical this foundational step is. Before you can apply advanced genetic genealogy, you must have an organized investigative matrix.
Because you need context.
Exactly. When the genetic genealogist eventually hands you a surname or a geographic location, you need to be able to instantly cross-reference that data against every single tip, every single vehicle registration, and every single field interview conducted since 1983. Without the student's digital architecture, the genetic data would be unsearchable.
With the files finally organized and searchable in late 2024 and early 2025, the Michigan State Police forge a partnership with Othram. Othram is a private laboratory that specializes specifically in forensic genetic genealogy and dealing with impossible DNA samples.
They are really pioneers in this space.
The police send over the biological evidence, that exact same semen sample extracted from the sanitary napkin back in 1983. Now, Othram can't just throw it in a machine, right? They have to assess if this 40-year-old sample is even viable.
Right, there's a huge vetting process.
They're checking for the quantity of DNA left, the quality of the degradation, ensuring there's only a single human contributor. And critically, they have to fight off the non-human bacterial DNA that has inevitably grown on the sample over 4 decades.
The scientific and bioinformatic hurdles here are immense. DNA is a fragile molecule. It degrades naturally when exposed to moisture, UV light, fluctuating temperatures, and obviously the passage of time.
40 years of time.
But the bacterial contamination is the real challenge. When Othram sequences a sample like this, they are reading millions of fragments of DNA. To separate the human DNA from the bacterial DNA, they use advanced bioinformatics.
How does that actually work?
They map all the sequence fragments against a pristine reference human genome. Since bacterial genomes are circular and fundamentally different in their sequence structure, the software can digitally identify and discard the bacterial noise, isolating only the fragmented human data.
That is mind-blowing. They are digitally filtering out the decay of 40 years to find the human signal. Once Othram isolated the viable human DNA, they utilized a technology that is light years beyond the STR testing of 2002. They use what is called forensic-grade genome sequencing.
This is it. This is the technological leap that changes everything.
So what does this all mean? Let's precisely define that leap.
As we discussed, the 2002 STR testing looked at roughly 20 specific markers on the DNA strand, just enough to confirm an exact identity if you already have the suspect. Othram's sequencing, however, maps hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, commonly referred to as SNPs.
Okay, so how do SNPs physically work differently than STRs?
Instead of looking for repeating stutters in the DNA like an STR test, SNPs look at single-letter variations in the genetic code across the entire genome. These single-letter changes are passed down through generations. By mapping hundreds of thousands of these SNPs, the sequencing fundamentally reconstructs the perpetrator's entire genetic blueprint.
So it's way more comprehensive.
Vastly more. It reviews complex biogeographical ancestry, where their ancestors came from, and most importantly, it allows investigators to identify distant genetic relatives. It connects the suspect's DNA to cousins, second cousins, and half-siblings who have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to public genealogical databases like GDmatch or Family Tree DNA.
I want to make sure this is crystal clear, so let me try a different analogy for you. The old STR test is like having a suspect's exact zip code, great if they live there, completely useless if they don't. The new SNP sequencing is like having a precise GPS coordinate that traces every road their ancestors ever walked, gradually narrowing the roads until you were standing on his exact front porch. It doesn't just identify him, it hunts him down through his bloodline.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
But let me ask you this, is the real hero of this story the incredible SNP technology, or is it those WMU students who essentially built the digital map that the detectives needed to navigate the past?
It is the absolute symbiotic relationship between the two. The genetic sequencing provides the raw geographic and familial coordinates, but the digital map built by the students allows the detectives to actually traverse the historical terrain.
They need each other.
Yes. If Othram gives you a last name, but you can't search your 1983 files to see if a man with that name was ever pulled over near the crime scene, the genetic profile is just a floating, useless data point. The science requires the context of the history to function.
And navigating that terrain was incredibly complex. Because once Othram ran the massive genome sequencing, the primary lead they generated didn't point to Flint, Michigan. It pointed to a woman living in Wichita, Kansas. A sweet older lady with no criminal record. But here's the catch, and it is a massive logistical hurdle. This woman had 79 grandchildren.
That is a staggering genealogical net to cast.
79.
When genetic genealogists find a distant relative in these public databases, they can't just arrest them. They have to build the family tree. They have to trace the ancestry backward to find the common ancestor, perhaps a great-great-grandparent that the Kansas woman shares with the unidentified killer. Once they find that common ancestor, they have to build the tree forward again, identifying every single descendant down to the present day. With 79 grandchildren, you are looking at an exponentially expanding web of cousins, second cousins, half-siblings, and marriages.
Detective Art and his partner actually flew out to Wichita, Kansas. They sit down with this woman, explain the situation delicately, and they get voluntary DNA samples from her and her son. They send those fresh, pristine samples back to Othram to refine the genetic math.
And then begins months of painstaking, tedious work.
Yeah. The police, the scientists at Othram, and those WMU students using open source intelligence obituaries, marriage records, property deeds, they start chopping branches off this massive family tree. They are looking for a male born in the early 1950s who has a geographic connection to Flint, Michigan in the fall of 1983.
It's an incredible process of elimination.
Through genetic triangulation and relentless investigative elimination, they cross off name after name until they narrow this sprawling 79-branch tree down to one highly viable suspect. His name was Ronnie Collins.
This is where we have to deeply analyze the profile of Ronnie Collins, because the reality of who he was completely shatters our preconceived notions of violent predators. The concept of the monster in plain sight truly crystallizes here.
It really does.
In 2025, when they identify him, he is 75 years old. Back in 1983, at the exact time of Sherry's prolonged abduction and murder, he was in his early 30s.
And his life is terrifyingly, boringly normal. He had absolutely no significant criminal history. People in his community thought he was a good citizen. He was a family man. He worked a steady, respected job. And if you're listening, get ready for this detail because it is deeply unsettling. Ronnie Collins worked as a dental hygienist inside a Michigan state prison.
It's almost unbelievable.
He treated the inmates. He knew exactly what the inside of a cell looked like. He walked past bars every day knowing he belonged behind them. In his free time, he played music in a traveling band that gigged around various Michigan towns. And the detail that made my blood run completely cold, in 1983, Ronnie Collins drove a white van.
The white van. If you comb back through the digitized notes from the WMU students, one of the original quickly discarded tips from 1983 was a fleeting sighting of Sherry near a white van.
Wow, so it was there all along.
But because it lacked specificity, it was completely lost in the overwhelming noise of the thousands of incoming tips, buried entirely by the fabricated wild goose chase of the yellow Camaro.
Oh, we have this ingrained cultural myth that a murderer wears their evil on their sleeve. We expect them to look disheveled, to act bizarrely, to resemble some cinematic villain with a facial scar. We don't expect them to be cleaning teeth and playing the guitar at a local bar on a Friday night. He was a total chameleon.
Completely compartmentalized.
So, does a criminal who avoids capture for 40 years do it through sheer criminal genius? Or is it mostly just the dumb luck of operating before the genetic era?
It is overwhelmingly the latter, but it is heavily supported by a specific psychological trait common in successful psychopaths: the profound ability to compartmentalize. The successful psychopath isn't necessarily an evil genius orchestrating complex plots. Rather, they are entirely devoid of the empathy and internal guilt that might cause a normal person to break down, act erratically, or eventually confess. Ronnie Collins possessed the chilling psychological architecture to commit an act of unspeakable savagery, holding a girl captive for days, executing her, and then going to work cleaning teeth the very next morning, feeling absolutely no cognitive dissonance.
It's chilling.
The fact that he was never caught wasn't a masterstroke of evasion. It was the geographical luck of selecting a victim randomly in an era where investigative science simply could not connect a stranger to a crime scene without an eyewitness.
But the science, advancing relentlessly in the background of his life, finally caught up to him. In late 2025, Detective Art has his name and his location. He reaches out to Ronnie Collins. He doesn't kick the door down with a SWAT team. He plays it cool. He just calls him up and says he wants to talk about some old cases.
A very standard tactic.
And Collins does exactly what cornered animals do. He stalls. He pushes the meeting off, claiming he's busy through the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, ultimately agreeing to meet with Detective Art in early January 2026.
Stalling in this context is a classic, highly indicative behavioral response.
Yeah.
It is a suspect realizing that the invisible net has suddenly dropped over them. It's a desperate attempt to buy time, to formulate a strategy, to gauge how much the police actually know, or in this specific case, to execute a final exit plan.
Detective Art sets up the interview, waits around on the agreed upon day, and Collins is a complete no-show. He stops answering his phone, goes totally off the grid. So in early February 2026, Detective Art drops the pleasantries. He takes the Othram genealogical data to a judge and secures a search warrant specifically for Collins's DNA.
He's going in for the definitive proof.
He and his partner drive to Collins' house, warrant in hand, ready to finally physically confront this man and take the swab. They knock on the door. Collins' current wife answers, and she tells the stunned detectives that on the exact day that January interview is supposed to happen, Ronnie Collins committed suicide.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of cold case resolutions in the current era, this is an increasingly common, highly specific phenomenon. Forensic genetic genealogy is inducing a profound, silent panic among a very specific demographic. Aging, previously undetected violent offenders.
The walls are closing in on them.
Exactly. These are men who have lived their entire adult lives believing they completely got away with their crimes. Suddenly, a detective calls referencing a date from 40 years ago, and they instantly understand the brutal math of the situation.
They watch the news. They know the science is infallible now.
They know that if the police are calling, it means the DNA is already spoken. And Ronnie Collins, perhaps more than anyone else, understood the absolute stakes. He spent his career working inside a prison. He knew intimately the violent, restrictive environment he was destined for. His suicide was a calculated, ultimate evasion of accountability.
It makes me furiously angry on behalf of the victim's family. We usually talk about suicide as a tragic mental health crisis, and in most cases it is. But in this specific context, suicide isn't a tragic mental health crisis. It's a calculated final act of theft.
It really is.
He stole Sherry's life in 1983. He stole 43 years of peace and security from her family. And then at the very end, he stole the family's right to confront him in a courtroom. He stole the handcuffs, the trial, and the verdict. In the eyes of the law and the eyes of the detectives, does an avoidance suicide like this function as a de facto confession?
Psychologically and practically, absolutely yes. While the legal system strictly requires a trial by jury for a formal conviction, seasoned investigators recognize this specific pattern suicide immediately following contact regarding a cold case as the ultimate flight response.
It's an admission of guilt.
It is an admission that the evidence is insurmountable. However, law enforcement cannot and does not rely on the psychological implication alone to close a case. They still require empirical, irrefutable scientific proof.
Which they got. Despite his suicide, the police were able to legally collect his DNA during his autopsy. They took that pristine sample, sent it to the state lab, and ran a direct CODIS comparison against the STR profile extracted from the 1983 sanitary napkin.
And the result was definitive.
It was a perfect match. The state lab confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Ronnie Collins was the perpetrator. They finally had their ghost. But the story doesn't end neatly there with a closed file. The final segment of this deep dive explores the messy, agonizing aftermath of the truth.
Because resolving a cold case doesn't just identify the guilty party, it also, crucially, permanently exonerates the innocent who are caught in the crossfire.
And this is where the tragedy of the timeline compounds exponentially. When Detective Art finally called Joyce to tell her the news that they found the man, that it was a stranger named Ronnie Collins, one of the first things she said was that she desperately wished her husband Bob, Sherry's stepfather, was still alive to hear it.
That is just heartbreaking.
Bob had passed away in January 2025, just months before Othram made the genealogical breakthrough. He went to his grave having lived his entire adult life under the dark shadow of community suspicion, having been put through absolute psychological hell by the initial 1980s investigation.
It is a devastating, visceral reminder of the collateral damage of unsolved crimes. The stain of suspicion ruins reputations, destroys marriages, and degrades physical health.
It killed him, essentially, or at least ruined his life.
The exoneration, while historically and morally vital, often arrives too late to actually repair the human damage inflicted by the initial rush to judgment.
And then there is the surreal, almost dystopian clash of realities that happened on the internet shortly after. After Collins died, his friends and extended family, who had absolutely no idea he was a violent monster, posted a glowing online obituary for him.
They praised him.
Yeah, they talked about what a good guy he was, his love of music, his dedication to his family. Joyce found this page, and she commented on it simply and powerfully. No, he didn't. He murdered my daughter.
That is an incredible, profound moment of modern confrontation. It is the real-time collision of this psychopath's carefully constructed lifelong mask with the horrific, undeniable reality of his true nature.
It caused such an uproar among his friends, who were aggressively defending him in total denial, that the website actually had to pull the obituary page down entirely. That digital obituary fight is such a visceral clash of two realities: the mask he wore and the monster he was. Joyce hijacking that page is the ultimate reclamation of truth.
She refused to let him be memorialized as a good man.
But even with the truth out there, and even with the DNA confirmation locking him to Sherry, Detective Art is looking at Ronnie Collins' life timeline and realizing something deeply chilling.
The timeline, combined with the extreme escalation of violence, is highly concerning to behavioral analysts.
Yes. Detective Art stated plainly that you do not usually start your criminal career by abducting, holding, raping, and execution-style murdering a 16-year-old girl when you are in your early 30s.
There is almost always a progression of escalating offenses: beeping, burglary, assault. Law enforcement assumes Collins has other victims out there.
In fact, he is now a highly viable suspect in another notorious Michigan cold case from 1969.
The missing girls of Oscoda.
Right. Halloween weekend, 1969. Two young girls, last names Hovley and Spencer, left school early in Oscoda, Michigan. They vanished without a trace. The last time they were seen by witnesses, they were getting into a white van. And where was Ronnie Collins that exact weekend? His band was playing a gig right there in Oscoda.
The geographic and circumstantial overlap is highly compelling. The use of a white van as a mobile tool for abduction. The proximity to his band's travel route providing a built-in alibi for being in the area. It perfectly fits the behavioral profile of an opportunistic mobile predator who uses his transient lifestyle to mask his crimes and distance himself from his victims.
But with Collins dead, how do investigators try to solve a 1969 cold case where the only links are a white van, a band gig, and a ghost? Without bodies to yield physical evidence, it feels like an absolutely impossible puzzle.
It is incredibly difficult, bordering on the impossible. Without a crime scene or physical remains, there is no DNA to sequence, no matter how advanced Othram's technology gets. Investigators have to revert from forensic science back to traditional, painstakingly slow detective work.
So they're back to square one.
They might use ground-penetrating radar on properties he owned in the 60s and 70s. They will interview surviving former bandmates about his exact movements and demeanor that weekend. They will search his remaining belongings for any trophies or souvenirs he might have kept for the victims.
But there's no guarantee.
But the harsh reality is, the families of those 1969 victims may never receive the definitive, scientifically irrefutable proof that Sherry's family finally received.
Which brings us to the final, sobering reality for Joyce. Detective Art asked her how finally knowing the truth after 43 years would affect her life, and her response completely shatters the Hollywood myth of a neat, tidy ending. She said, "It's not going to. Nothing's changed. I still can't hug her."
The physical absence remains permanent.
Right. What haunts her isn't the mystery of who anymore. It's the unbearable knowledge of those 3 to 4 days her daughter was held captive, terrified, and alone before she was killed.
We so often use the word closure in the media when talking about solved cold cases. But trauma professionals and the surviving families will tell you that closure is a comforting myth for the public, not a reality for the grieving.
It doesn't fix anything.
The resolution of a case provides objective truth. It provides historical accuracy. It permanently exonerates the innocent, and it ensures the predator can never strike again. But it does not heal the trauma. It does not undo the violence.
It's a permanent amputation of the family tree. Sherry Joe Elliot deserved a life. She was 16 years old, planning her outfits, watching her soap operas. She deserved to grow up, to experience the world, maybe have children of her own. All of that potential was violently erased by a man who then went on to live a comfortable, socially acceptable life for 43 more years.
It's a very difficult truth to sit with.
Which leaves you with a thought I want you to actively carry with you today. Think about the people you pass every single day. The person standing behind you in the grocery store aisle, the mechanic changing your oil, or the dental hygienist asking you to open wide. For 43 years, Ronnie Collins was just a guy in the community. A family man hiding a 16-year-old girl's agonizing final days behind a polite, professional smile. How many other good citizens are out there right now, blending in, carrying a decades-old, horrific secret?
And flip that perspective. How does it feel for them sitting in their living rooms today, knowing that right now, somewhere in a lab, a university student is digitizing a dusty file and a scientist is sequencing a single 40-year-old drop of DNA that will finally, inevitably, tear their mask off?
That is the ultimate power of this technology. It isn't just a lab test, it is a time machine that drags the hidden truth violently into the present. We want to remind you to never give up hope on the past, because the science is finally moving faster than the shadows can hide. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking closely at the quiet details, and we'll catch you next time.